I think I'd rather tell it than read it. This is a very familiar passage to people that grew up going to church out of 1 Kings. When Ahab had married a woman from a neighboring country where the religion was the worship of Baal, Jezebel, she had set up altars, built a temple, and had begun trying to change the country from the Hebrew faith to the faith of Baal. There was never a time in either ancient Judah or ancient Israel where they only had one religion. The way the Old Testament is written makes it seem like there were just slight derivations here and there. Not true. There were even idols set up in the courtyard of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. There were always competing religions, but the Jewish religion was the dominant one and the evolving one and the one that usually commanded the army. So they got to write the books. But during this time of contest in the northern kingdom, the prophet Elijah was active, and there was allegedly this contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And they were going to check and see whose God was the true God. And so they built two altars, set sacrifice on the altars, and then the prophets of Baal were to pray and see if they could get Baal to ignite it. They prayed, they sang, they blew trumpets, they even cut themselves, all the while that Elijah is teasing them. Well, maybe he's asleep, maybe he's on vacation, maybe he's gone off the path, which is a euphemism for going to pee behind a tree. And of course, nothing happens. So when it's Elijah's turn to elevate the drama, the story says he had people come and pour hundreds of gallons of water over the wood and the sacrifice on the altar that he had built. And then he prays to God, and whew, it's not only burned up, but it leaves a charred hole in the ground where the altar was. It burns the wood, the sacrifice, the stones, and the ground underneath. And so Jehovah wins, or Yahweh wins the contest. And then in true, I would say Christian, but Christianity was coming 800 years later, Elijah took a sword and killed hundreds of prophets of Baal, because once you win a debate, that's what you do, I guess. So there's that. Shortly after the war in Iraq was launched, Lieutenant General William Boykin was tasked with either finding or killing Osama bin Laden. And perhaps because his previous assignments had gone so well, because he was the guy in charge of flying helicopters into Iran to rescue our hostages at the embassy there in 1980, and in 1982 assigned to arrest Pablo Escobar in Colombia. He got this important job of finding Osama bin Laden. Now, Boykin is a very religious man, so religious that a military psychiatrist had once evaluated him and said that he was not safe for military service, but his defenders just came out and said, Brother Boykin is a fine Christian gentleman. So he took on the search for Osama bin Laden like a religious crusade. He delivered a speech to an evangelical Christian event in 2003 in which he said, "I knew my God was bigger than his. I knew that my God was real and his was an idol." He encouraged his Christian audience saying, "We in the army of God, in the house of God, in the kingdom of God, have been raised for just such a time as this." That same year, he told another religious audience that his boss, President George W. Bush, is in the White House because God put him there. And you see, some of you cynics thought it was because a partisan group of 5 Supreme Court justices put him there. But according to Boykin, it was God, and we can conclude that, in fact, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Though Bush tried to distance himself from Boykin's anti-Muslim statements, he was not fired. He retired from military service in 2006, having failed in the search for Osama bin Laden, as he had failed in his other 2 high-profile assignments. However, Boykin was recently fired, just in the last month, from a teaching position he took in Virginia in retirement, reportedly for refusing to allow transgender students to use the restroom of their choice. Bigotry against Muslims never seemed to hurt his career, but the transgender community is well organized and we should all pay attention. Legislators in Texas, North Carolina, and South Dakota, and Illinois, and Indiana, and Kentucky, and Mississippi, as well as our home state of Missouri, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Virginia, Washington, and Wisconsin, are all trying to express the same prejudice that Boykin got fired for, because it appears that stupid bigotry is not regionally contained. Now, it's obvious that General Boykin is one of the most shocking, unself-aware people ever to be in a position of leadership, but I didn't tell you about Boykin simply to mock him for his ignorant prejudice. I mention him today to tell us something about ourselves. It's like what Melissa Harris Perry recently said about Donald Trump. The mere fact that Donald Trump is a racist, a xenophobe, a misogynist, and a violent man, that he is popular is the real issue. What he is as a single individual is almost irrelevant. But Melissa Harris Perry said that Trump is like a mirror being held up to American society, in which we see that racism, that misogyny, that xenophobia is us. It's a part of our society. Trump is irrelevant, but he is revealing our id, that dark side of ourselves that still harbors racism even after we've had an African-American president. You know, racism, we thought that night in 2008 when we were laughing and screaming and celebrating that racism was officially over. And what Obama did was not end racism, but turn on the light to reveal how deep the roots are and how far it goes. But the Trump campaign is revealing to us the horrible qualities that are still very popular among American voters, that where in many places it's become absolutely socially unacceptable to have a Confederate flag in the back of your pickup truck, now you can put a Trump bumper sticker so that you can say, I'm still a racist. I don't have a flag anymore, but I'm still a racist. Trump's candidacy is like a dipstick that is making it increasingly evident that America is a couple of quarts low on intelligence, morality, and civility. Our lectionary reading today is from the well-known contest recorded in 1 Kings of the Hebrew Bible. In the 8th century, not long after there had been a civil war that divided the Jewish kingdom between Judah to the south and Israel to the north, there came a king in the north named Ahab, who married the daughter of a neighboring king in Tyre. Ahab's foreign-born wife, Jezebel, persuaded Ahab to abandon the Hebrews' religion and worship the Assyrian god Baal. Now, history is always written by the victors, and religious history is written from the perspective of whatever eventually becomes the orthodox view of history. So the Bible tells us that Ahab was evil, and his wife Jezebel was even more evil than he was, because they were straying from the Hebrew faith. Of course, you have to realize that if they had been successful in that reform, then there would be stained glass windows of Ahab and Jezebel in churches all over Europe and North America, that they would be remembered as our Abraham and Moses that had rescued our religion. There's more at work here than meets the eye. These texts were all redacted in the temple cult of the southern kingdom of Judah, so their rival state to the north always gets portrayed as the bad guys. If it is possible to have less journalistic integrity than modern newspapers, the people who wrote the Bible had an agenda, and that agenda trumped any concern they might have had about actually recording accurate history. So they tell about how a wicked king and his horribly evil wife tried to lead the people astray, but God had a superhero who was a preacher. You got to love those films. And he managed to kill the bad guys and restore the faith. Now, this narrative is just the gravy that covers the meat of the politics that was playing out beneath the religious language. The tiny kingdoms of the ancient world had shifting loyalties and alliances that helped them to survive. There were always big players somewhere in the field, whether it was Egypt or Babylon or Assyria. So the smaller states were always trying to form alliances that would allow them to survive. Ahab didn't meet Jezebel on a Palestinian Match.com. Theirs was an arranged marriage to bring these two weak kingdoms together in an alliance, primarily against their stronger southern neighbor of Judah. In the ancient worlds, the gods were conceived as living in heaven just above the temple where they were worshipped. Yahweh wasn't just the God of Judah. Yahweh lived in Judah, just above the clouds above Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. So when the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon, you can literally hear echoes of a concern in the Psalms that were written in Babylon about whether God could even hear them say prayers or hear their hymns of praise from several hundred miles away. The gods of the ancient world were associated with a nation, with a place. Their temple was their home. In almost every case, the god of a given nation would be a war god. Now, they might have other gods for agriculture or fertility or whatever, but their god that they identified with was their war god. And in Exodus, we see Moses building an ark of the covenant, and historians suggest that the greatest likelihood is that that ark was a giant throne, that it was actually carried into battle to make it look like their invisible god of war was being carried into battle with them. So the graphic battle between Elijah and the prophets of Baal represented a clash of nations, not just of religions, but of the religions of the Eastern Assyrian cult and the Hebrew cult. And they were checking to see which culture was going to survive. The Battle of the United States against the nation of Iraq was portrayed by General Boykin as a battle between the Christian God and the Muslim God. And Boykin was willing to say that our God is the greater God, a sadly sophomoric yet theological way of saying, my dad can beat up your dad. And in this case, he was right, because my dad is armed with sophisticated artillery, an air force, and a navy, none of which your dad has. A great deal of the hostility between the Muslim world and the West is articulated in religious language, but the real fear is cultural domination. If their cars, electronics, clothes, and even their foods fall to Western influence, if their TV shows, their movies, and music all come from Hollywood and New York, they feel what it means to have who they are being destroyed day by day by cultural domination. Now, countries like France and Spain have long had laws that mandated that their TV and radio stations have to play at least 40% of their content from either France or Spain, and 60% of their content has to come from Europe. Who are they aiming that at, of course? To keep American culture from dominating all of Europe, from destroying their own TV production, their own musicians, their own industries that are advertised on those shows. The U.S. dominates the world. Our culture, our fashion, our fast food are pervasive the world over. The first time I went to the Middle East, I got out of a plane in Amman, Jordan, got on a bus, went out into the wilderness, and some little kids are always there asking for money, and they ask where you're from, and I said Kentucky. Kentucky Fried Chicken. You know, they immediately recognize Pizza Hut and Taco Bell and Kentucky Fried Chicken in the most remote corners of the world. And yet we all know people who get scared out of their minds if they see a woman at the mall wearing a hijab, or if they see Spanish signs at Home Depot. Our culture is everywhere. Our food, our clothes, our cars, our electronics, everywhere. But we get horribly frightened if we're afraid that there's a subset of immigrants living in a neighborhood that might begin to take over that neighborhood. And somehow extremists on both sides want us to believe that the real issue is Allah versus Yahweh, and that somehow these two gods are locked into a death match in a heavenly arena. The story of Elijah is told in 1 Kings to encourage the kind of xenophobia that General Boykin articulated, that the Iraq War wasn't about controlling the oil fields of the Middle East. It was actually to prove that Christianity is superior to Islam. No one wants to send their sons or daughters to fight and possibly die defending low gasoline prices. But they may be willing to sacrifice their own children to preserve not simply our brand of religion, but to defend country music and NASCAR and Levi's and Coke and McDonald's and Jack Daniels and, folks, bacon. You know, if Muslims run our grocery stores, no more bacon. Bacon would become a black market thing, just like heroin and crack cocaine. When politicians talk about fighting for our way of life, they're talking about bacon. They're talking about our specific consumer tastes, our way of life, the way we drive, the way we live, the way we eat. Fanatics may focus on the tenets of one faith against another faith, but governments are not interested in religion, not the governments of the East or the governments of the West. They're concerned with economics primarily and power secondarily. Jews and Muslims fight in the Middle East. Hindus and Muslims fight on the Indian subcontinent. Muslims and Buddhists fight in Indonesia. The largely secular or Christian West is willing to fight any religion and anyone anywhere all over the globe. But I will say this, and as soon as I say it, everyone within the sound of my voice will know instinctively that what I am saying is absolutely true. Scrape away all the hocus pocus from all of the world's religions, and underneath all of the rituals, creeds, and holy books, everyone that practices those various faiths is really just trying to find out how to be a better person. That's really all it is. We have nothing to fight about. We're just trying to figure out how to make our lives a little better, to make the world a little better for our children and our grandchildren. And at the heart of what it takes to make us better people and to make the world better for our kids is flatly refusing to be manipulated into another war that sends the poor of America to fight and kill the poor of another nation. Amen. Let the people say, amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.